Hello and welcome to another video on the Yu-Gi-Oh channel. Now we have undergone a rebranding and this is still the Zach Garnish channel. It's just that we've changed the name of the channel itself. All of the content is going to be exactly the same kind of thing, and as per usual we're going off on a slightly odd section here. We're actually going to be talking about the ratios of cards played in pure striker lists, but not just any list. Specifically, at the 200th YCSs, we're looking at decks that made it into Top Cut and how ratios changed throughout that. So, when you first make it into Top Cut, obviously you have to be able to beat the majority of the meta. Now at a YCS, this could be a lot of sort of rogue matchups that you face throughout the day, and maybe towards the end of the day you faced off against a few of the true metas. So for this event, or for these events, it was mostly pure Sky Striker, although at Columbus, of course, there was quite a heavy Goki presence, and there was some interesting BA lists that came out of this kind of thing as well, but definitely pure Striker as sort of the dominant deck throughout these sets of events. So that's the kind of thing that you'd expect to be facing towards the end of the event, the Swiss rounds, and it's definitely the main thing that you would be facing in Top Cut. So if you wanted to win the event, you not only had to make it through all of those rounds of Swiss, you also had to be able to, in knockout rounds, consistently beat mirror matches, which is really, really important if you're trying to not only make it into Top Cut but win. So hopefully we're going to be able to help you guys out a little bit, showing you some numbers and some, mostly looking at some graphs that show how ratios of cards change as you progress up Top Cut, so going from top 64 to 32 to top 16, all the way up to the finals. You know, what changes in your deck are made in order for you to be able to compete at that level and take on all the competition. So we have some lovely data here, assembled by Alessandro Melegari, who has grabbed all the data from, I think it was taken from YouTube, for YCSs for Columbus, and for Utrecht here, and for Mexico City here. Now this is basically only looking at the main decks, and you can see we've got the different competitors here. So if you're interested in grabbing any of this data, I'll put a link to his original spreadsheet so that you can take a look and you can see all of the sort of ratios that are played, and how he's calculated it out. So one thing is, if you've watched my What Makes a Pure Striker List video, which I'll put a card up to at some point during this video, you'll know that I talk a little bit about the mean decks and the mode decks. So what he's assembled here is a list of the mean averages of all the different cards in this column for percentage played, essentially. And this is a good indicator for, it's the best indicator for a small number of decks, so if you have like 10 or 15, which is pretty appropriate for this sort of setup. But ideally when you're looking at a card game, you want to be looking at the mode, because that tells you what the majority of people are playing. But obviously you need those majority to be good people as well, which is kind of difficult to come across because you don't have enough data. So in this case we're looking at the mean averages. Just wanted to clarify that to start off with. So we're going to take a look at the data from Utrecht here, which I have divided into the different sections of the Top Cut, so 64, 32, 16, 18, top 4, final and winner. I think the final and the winner, they're exactly the same here. So up until the top 4 is when you have diversity within your Sky Striker list. You have more than one, and you can see how the ratios change. Obviously it's a lot of numbers, so it's kind of difficult to take in like this, so I've assembled a couple of different plots here. So we start off with the monster plots, and some of these are a little bit simplified. So looking at this, we can see, I think the most important thing to follow is anything that changes drastically over the course of the Top Cut heading into the finals. So when you're starting out in top 64, we see Diabolos still exists, Ghost Spell is still a card, everyone's playing Triple Ray, which is a thin blue line you can kind of see up here. Some people weren't actually playing Triple Ash Blossom, so that's why there's this little dip here which goes up, and then as you get further into Top Cut, everyone's playing 3 Ash Blossoms, so it seems like it's the way to go if you want to win mirror matches. And then interestingly, Ghost Ogre started out as being pretty popular, with an average of just under 2. But as you progress into Top Cut, you see it starts to drop down a bit. There's a spike here in top 4 because you have very few decks that you're looking at, and I think one of them was playing Triple Ghost Ogre or something like that. But then heading down and into the finals, you drop out Ghost Ogres entirely because it's just not that relevant in Sky Striker mirror matches. So if you want to win, run lower ratios of Ghost Ogre so that you can allow yourself to play better cards, essentially. Then we move on to the spells here. So there's quite a lot of information, probably too many lines to really assess. So what I've done is I've made another version, and I've cut out everything that is a clear staple. So anything that's a staple 2 of and nobody's changing, like here, this is terraforming, I've cut that out entirely. Or anything that seems like it's stable and it's sticking close to a particular value, I've probably cut that out as well. So I think this one here, which is Afterburners, which most people are playing 1, has been cut out from this one, because we're just looking at stuff that changes significantly. What probably changes about the least, Twin Twisters, very popular at the start, more and more popular as you go through, so it becomes a 3-of for pretty much every deck that makes it deep into top cut. Eagle Boosters, again, you know, it starts off about 2, and we see that this spikes up heading into the finals. It takes a little while to get there, so, you know, it's sort of like the, I think it's Nico who took this as a 3-of. He's probably one of the few people who spotted that as a good option in mirror matches. And then multi-roll, again, you know, most people playing 2 or 3, that's kind of like, it's kind of 50-50 between those two. And then the people who made it further into top cut all playing 3-of, so everyone in the top 4 who had a striker list playing it there. This one's really interesting, actually. Galaxy Cyclone here, we see is not very popular in the top 64, because most of us didn't run it at all. But the few people who did run it, they carried on, they did exceptionally well. So we see this ratio rise and rise and rise. There's a little dip here, but that's not really our focus because there weren't very many decks involved at this point. But we see this general upward trend as a result of Galaxy Cyclone being really important. This little bump up here, this doesn't actually signify anything. This is just how Google Sheets adjusts its values. This is actually a straight line here because obviously Nico was in the final and Nico was the winner, and he was the only Sky Striker list there. Then in order to fit these Galaxy Cyclones in and the Twin Twisters as the ideal spell or trap removal, you have to cut something. So MST here is starting off at 1 on average and then dropping down to nothing. Call by the Grave also being dropped out, not that relevant apparently for winning top cut here. But Foolish Goods carries on rising. I cut out the fusion because you can just track it from the Foolish Goods here. So that again is a very popular choice if you want to win, essentially. And then Jamming Waves, so it's not especially important. It's between 1 and 0, and then it drops off to the final. So take from that what you want. Looking at the traps here, nobody was running 3-ofs as far as I can tell, or at least there wasn't a majority 3-ofs of anything. Even the match, this is pretty interesting, so not very popular at the start. Deeper that you get into top cut, the more prevalent it is within the decks that remained. So pretty good in the mirror match, but then not good enough if you know how to play around it, essentially here. Typhoon, again, we see the spike. So a potentially useful card, but not super relevant as it never makes it past a half here. Duster, again, so some people spying it early, so it seems like it's pretty good. You can win probably 1 or 2 matches off just having this, but it becomes less and less popular as people learn to play around it. And Mind Crush 2, not, so a lot of people went into the event thinking it would be really good, and it's probably quite good in Swiss, but people just play around this, especially with Twin Twisters, you can play around it, so it just drops off straight away. And Impermanence here, not proving to do any serious damage to the top cut. So that's our first review of these sets of plots. I'll try and run through the next set a bit quicker. So that was from Utrecht, where obviously Summon Sorceress isn't out, Pure Sky Striker massively dominating the event, and dominating top cut as well. And you can head on to the spreadsheet, there'll be a link in the description. You can grab just the average deck if you want to build based on that, or you can grab Nico's list and take the winning list from the event. So on to New Mexico. They didn't penetrate beyond top 8 actually, so 64 up to top 8, because there were just other strategies which were too powerful for pure strikers, it seems. Or perhaps the builds weren't quite in line in the same way. So here we have the monsters. Ash Blossom staple 3-of, Ghost Ogre, actually more important here, it sticks around at 2. and gets a bit higher. I think this is because it was attempting to combat a meta that had more combo decks in it. At Utrecht it was very much dominated by Sky Strikers. In New Mexico I think it started off with a lot of Sky Strikers, but they rapidly dropped away because they just didn't win matches enough. So making it into top 8, Ghost Ogre becomes pretty important. Probably a 2 of, but it did appear as a 3 of within the top 8 list. But perhaps not the best for the mirror matches. Then DD Crow here, so a few people running this, becoming a bit more important towards top 16, but heading into top 8 nobody's running it. So this is an option certainly, but probably not something that's going to win you the event itself. Gamma, however, extremely strong rise here because it's just important in top 16 and top 8. I think it was in the list that took top 8. So initially, not very many people running it. The deeper in you get, the more people are running Gamma for the remaining proportions. So definitely an option worth considering. But then again, it's not the thing that pushes you further than top 8, at least not in this case. It certainly could in a different event. It depends, it's very much a high risk, high reward kind of card that you would play. Then Sky Blasters, not super popular. Ghost Spells, really not that popular. We have the driver here, nothing really on the rise, everything else sort of drops away. This one here is the Effect Failure, I think, which also you see fairly popular at the start, but then just sort of drops away over time. So on to the spells. Again, way too many variables to look at here. There are just too many spells within the deck. 7 more here is on top. So we cut down to just the ones where you see interesting trends, I think. So Shared Ride, very, very popular, and it maintains popularity throughout because it's just very good in mirror matches and it's very good against a lot of the meta. Area 02. We see a sort of smooth drop and then a rise up because the last few decks that made it into top cut did include 3 copies of Area Zero, but certainly a 2 or 3 of within competitive lists. Twisters on the rise here. Having 3 is very good in the mirror matches, but it doesn't allow you to combat those combo decks, which is why you see the sort of dip. And then here we have MST. Again, it's the same sort of thing in Utrecht. It's quite popular at the start because it is a good starter card for the deck, but it is much, much worse than running Twin Twisters, which is why we have the rise in Twin Twisters, but we don't have the rise in the MST here. And then on to Caught by the Grave, not super popular, it sort of just drops off because it doesn't do an awful lot. It's sort of reactionary at this stage. And then Upstart, just I was kind of surprised that people decided not to run Upstart in their list, but then we see it on the rise again towards the end here. Night Beam, an interesting option, but not really proving its worth within the top cut. And then the traps, not an awful lot to say here. Mind Crush initially had a reasonable outtaking, but not huge, and then it just sort of drops off as you head into top cut. Impermanence even lower, and Unending Nightmare. So proving its worth against some decks here, but overall not that great as a card really for the mirror matches. So stick to the Twin Twisters for your spell and trap removal. Really, I think is what you can gather from this data. And then on to Columbus. So a bit different here. We do make it from top 64 right the way through to the final. But obviously this is an event where Goki is actually a big deal, because Summon Sorceress was a legal card, which really changes up the meta, and it allows combo decks to push through a lot more. So we see a lot more sort of hand traps included within this list. I don't think we even saw Draw a Lot Bird in the previous versions. So let's take a look at how these ratios shift throughout the top cut then. So starting off top 64, obviously Bray is staple. Let's look at the things that are big movers here then. So we start off with Ash Blossom. Most people initially running it as 3 of. Actually, as you head into top cut, it becomes less and less popular, because people realize that hand traps weren't all that relevant within the mirror match. You could just sort of side into hand traps instead. Same kind of thing with Ghost Ogre. There's a bit of a dip here, which is where it's not that relevant in the mirror matches as much as Ash Blossom. So you found that people could win mirror matches without having so many copies of Ghost Ogres in their deck, or none at all. Then this sort of rise here, this is for the Sky Blaster package. I really like the Sky Blaster package in general because you're able to access that OTK, but it's never really run as a 3 of anymore. Even though there are arguments for and against it. It's not a starter card, of course, so that's not a great part for it, but it does put in work. Certainly, heading into the top cut, you can establish OTKs, which can be very important for beating an opponent, especially if you're siding in things like Hatrinade in this kind of mirror match, where you can stun all of your opponent's back row and then just kill them with Sky Blaster. So for the sort of low end here, what do we have? So we have Effect Veiler, which is solidly quite low, never really being that important within the main deck. Gamma 2 dropping right off because it doesn't make it into the final here, but still sort of similar values, similar levels of Effect Veiler. This is kind of like a choice between these two, really. Droll and Luckbird dropping down fairly quickly. It just doesn't do enough. Same with the Ibly, which you can't do so much with anymore. That drops off right away, so not especially good in the top cut. Spells, too many lines here. I like that they're all, you have this sort of convergence where we head to a smaller and smaller number of top cut striker lists, because you did have that large Goki component to the top cut. So I've cut it down a bit, but I've tried to include a lot of the things that I think are relevant here. So Twin Twisters actually came in at a higher standing than it left off. I think this is the first time we've seen that. And this is most likely, it's one of these things where you have combo decks that you have to face off against, and Twin Twisters does absolutely nothing to them. It's just not a valuable card in those scenarios, and it's bad to start with it if you're going up against a combo deck that doesn't use spells and traps as your only way to trigger your Area Zeros. That's a bit unfortunate, which means that it does drop off throughout the event. And we see the spike in top 4 where there were a few Sky Striker players playing against each other, but then after that they're obviously not anymore. Area Zero, interestingly, a few people starting off at 3 actually dropped down to 2. Again, this is one of the things where, because you're not competing with pure Sky Strikers as your primary opponent, you don't need more starter cards. You can just stun your opponent with your Widow Anchors and stuff, where in non-mirror matches, Widow Anchor puts in a lot more work than it does in mirror matches, as far as I'm aware. So your other cards, your sort of reactionary and advantage cards, put in more work, and the Area Zero puts in less work against this sort of combo list. Shared Ride, we see this nice bump here. This is, again, exactly the same as the Twin Twisters. This is where you have pure Striker players playing against each other, but when you go up against combo decks, your ratios go down, because it's not relevant in those scenarios. Then Terraforming, we see this sort of smooth decline, because the same reasons as Area Zero here. Call by the Grave actually has a nice rise here. It does have some utility against certain combo decks. It can definitely put in work against Goki, against Alter guys too, actually, and obviously in the mirror. But ultimately not super important, dropping down to 1 at the end. What else do we have that has a shift here? So this purple and this Pot of Desires rising up here. So we see a gradual rise because it does give you that extra advantage, and it's not too bad to banish your own stuff. This dip here, I would most likely associate with unfortunate scenarios of banishing cards that you actually want with your Desires. So when we have the rise, it's from Desires working well, and when we have the dip, it's from Desires working poorly, essentially. But most of the time it works well, so you head towards deeper areas of top cut. Afterburners doesn't really change, people running it at 1, and here we have the Eagle Booster, rising, because it is especially good in the mirror matches, so that is where it does most of the work. Jamming Waves drops away. Not super relevant against the combo decks. It does an okay amount versus the mirror match, but otherwise it doesn't do an awful lot. Hercules base also drops away, although it maintains a reasonably strong standing until the top 4. Foolish Goods leaves fairly quickly, which is in direct contrast to Utrecht, as far as I'm aware. And I think this is, again, I think it's that people found that they didn't need so many starter cards if they had so many reactionary cards, because the reactionary cards are just better against the combo decks, whereas you want the starter cards against the pure Sky Striker decks, because you need to win the mirror match, and you win the mirror match by having more starter cards and by having more advantage to your opponents. So these are cases where people running Foolish Goods faced some mirror matches and then stopped facing mirror matches, and everyone who wasn't running Foolish Goods had all those reactionary cards to beat opposing things, or just drew well enough to beat mirror matches anyway, and then the fusion drops away with those. And MST, of course, drops away because it is not as good as Twin Twisters. It's just, it's not going to put in as much work for your deck as Twisters can do. So on to the traps, the last bit here. So in permanence, actually, we start with the dip. This is because we have a lot of striker players playing against each other, and it's not very relevant there, but then we have this very steep rise as we head towards more and more people playing, actually 3 copies of it, I think. And that's because, again, you're facing a meta that is filled with combo decks. And what's good against combo decks? Hand traps that stop effects. So here we see Impermanence on the rise and sticking to 2 in the final. Solemn Strike starts off very low, and it essentially, I think it only goes up here. It only goes up until it hits 2 and then sticks there. It has a nice versatility in that it is good versus combo decks, because you're able to stop big plays, but it is also good against the mirror match where you can stop the Kagari coming out. And finally, I think we don't need to mention Mind Crush really. We see Heavy Storm Duster coming in, making it to 1, as was included in the final list, because it's very, very useful against back row decks or against Sky Strikers. So that has been a bit of a review of cards that are important for the making it deep into Top Cut. You know, if you want to win those Sky Striker mirror matches, or you want to be able to beat certain combo decks, it's a good idea to have this kind of data available, so you can get some understanding of what is good against what kind of meta. So in the combo meta, we see that the hand traps are a bit more important, the spell trap removal is a bit less important, and this Sky Blaster coming in because you're able to put in work, just OTKing opponents from positions where they don't expect it. Then, as we saw in Mexico and Utrecht, where you don't have the Summon Sorceress, the hand traps like Impermanence are just not so relevant, and they don't really make it very deep into Top Cut. Whereas things like the Eagle Booster is on the rise, Twin Twisters being a very, very strong card, and even Galaxy Cyclone here in Utrecht. What was the tech that was used in Mexico? The Twin Twisters, the high area 0 ratios, but they didn't really tech in very much spell trap removal. They just maintained the typical setup there. So if you're interested in picking up any of this data, head into the description. You'll get a link to Alessandro's spreadsheet. If you're interested in actually having access to these plots as well, let me know and I'll sort out an additional link, but you get all of the data anyway from his information, so that should pretty much cover you. It does include the average ratios for all those lists, as we see here. So you can use this to build your deck based on top 64, or if you want to build it based on top 32, that information is included in my spreadsheet, so you can do top 64, sorry, top 32, top 16, and just head deeper and deeper into Top Cut and see how the ratios vary as you progress. Hopefully this information is useful to you guys. Let me know if you're interested in this kind of content where it's data driven, and what kind of stuff you'd like to see. I will be doing an interesting thought piece coming up fairly soon, which talks about what kind of deck you should play based on your skills or your talents, and what kind of decks you should be avoiding as well. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.